Founding and senior pastor of Willow Creek Community Church, visionary leader behind the Global Leadership Summit, Bill Hybels joins us today, sharing his latest hard-won leadership lessons. Beginning his ministry at a little youth group in the Chicago suburbs, Bill Hybels was seized by a vision to create a church relevant to the unchurched. This vision planted the seeds of a movement that would eventually create an indelible impact on the church in America and abroad. Today, Willow Creek's influence is far-reaching. The lost have been found. Believers are finding and using their God-given gifts, and the local church is being raised up as the world-changing force that it is. And through the Global Leadership Summit, hundreds of thousands of leaders are being trained the world over. Please welcome Bill Hybels.
So in the early days of the Global Summit, I identified 8 critical functions of leadership. Here they are: casting vision, building teams, motivating and inspiring, solving problems, change management, establishing core values, allocating resources, and developing emerging leaders. For years in the early days of the summit, I built a case like a lawyer that if leaders would simply master these 8 skills, they would take their organizations to dizzying heights of effectiveness. So simple, really, right? And then for the last 2 decades, I've watched motivated leaders all over the world get better and better at all 8 of these critical functions, which has been thrilling. However, an alarming number of diligent leaders I know have not been setting effectiveness records as I predicted. Many are blowing their organizations up. They're losing their best teammates. They're getting into serious conflict with their board members. And observing this has led to long hours of reflection. How could leaders master these 8 basic functions of leadership and still have their organizations confused and divided and in some cases totally defeated? One day, a question came crashing into my brain. What if there's another list that leaders need to pay attention to, every bit as much as the list of the 8 critical functions of leadership? And if there is another list somewhere, who has it? How do I get it? What's on it? I began expressing those musings to my colleagues. They became as fascinated as I was. Then a few years ago, my trusty 80-year-old executive assistant put a book on my desk by Richard Davis titled The Intangibles of Leadership. It was not a new book. It was written in 2010. In it, the author argues that leaders at the highest level of effectiveness possess certain subtle, more advanced traits of leadership than all their peers. It is these leadership intangibles, the author claims, that sets them apart. I devoured the book. I made it mandatory reading for all of our top leaders. I heartily recommend it for all of you to read. And even though the book was never a bestseller, it certainly advanced my thinking to the point where today, with the time that remains in this session, I would like to unpack 5 aspects of leadership that don't get a lot of press, but they pack a huge leadership punch. The 5 intangibles of leadership. And the first is grit. Grit. Psychologist and researcher Angela Duckworth has devoted most of her career to understanding why people with lesser talent and lesser IQs often out-achieve their peers. After countless hours of research and controlled studies, she concluded that one of the greatest predictors of success in any walk of life has something to do with grit, which she defines as passion and perseverance over the long haul. I would add the following. Grit is unremitting, long-term tenacity. It is steely determination demonstrated over decades. It's the willingness to utilize every last drop of human effort to move something ahead and then to keep on expending that full output of energy until you cross a finish line. Gritty people play hurt. Gritty people don't whimper or waver or quit, ever. Gritty people expect progress to be difficult, yet believe to the core of their being that they can overcome whatever obstacle stands in their way. Now, most Americans would remember a little story that was read to us regularly at school when we were all young. It was called The Little Engine That Could. It's a story of a locomotive that's pulling a long line of train cars filled with toys for a village of poor children who were toyless. Now what happens is that the locomotive pulling the train realizes that there's a huge mountain between their current location and where the toys need to eventually be delivered. The locomotive loses confidence and says, I'll never make it up the mountain. So I'll try to find a more capable, higher horse-powered locomotive to take my place. So this locomotive approaches several other large, powerful train engines, many that could have done the job very easily. None of them are willing. They all have excuses, and they don't really care whether the poor kids on the other side of the mountain get the toys or not. Just when it looks like all hope is lost, an undersized engine that was only ever built to move empty rail cars around a small rail yard shows up and learns that all the poor kids on the other side of the mountain will get no toys unless a willing locomotive signs up for duty. And in a burst of passion, this tiny, undersized little engine says, I'll do it. All the other locomotives mock and jeer. In your dreams, they cry. Not deterred, the little engine backs up and hooks up to the long line of train cars filled with toys, and after considerable effort manages at least to get the train cars moving on the flat ground. But the real test lies ahead, and everyone knows it. There's a huge mountain that separates the toys from the poor children who have none. Again, every American my age will remember what happens next. This little engine approaches the mountain and realizes that every single bit of horsepower at its disposal is going to be required, so it applies maximum effort to this challenge. As it slowly ascends the huge incline, it's huffing and it's puffing and it's groaning and it's straining, and it begins the chant that all of us remember from half a lifetime ago. Say it with me in full voice, everybody everywhere. I think I can, I think I can, I think I can, yeah. And with steely, unremitting determination, the little engine makes it up the mountain, and the interesting part that most of us forgot is that as it's descending into the village of poor kids on the other side, it says with a satisfying smile, do you remember this? I thought I could, I thought I could, I thought I could. Gang, that's grit. It matters in life, and it especially matters in leadership. It's a differentiator. Those with ample amounts of it will predictably achieve more than those with less of it, regardless of talent or IQ. This has been observed all throughout history. One of the most celebrated and impactful leaders in the last 200 years suffered bankruptcy twice in his 20s, was defeated for political office shortly thereafter. Right after that, the young woman he loved and planned to marry died unexpectedly, causing this guy a near emotional breakdown. This same guy lost congressional races at age 34 and 36 and was defeated in a race for the U.S. Senate at age 47. But Abraham Lincoln had grit. And when he was finally elected as President of the United States at age 52, he tapped into that unremitting resolve, and he put an end to the scourge of slavery and brought our divided country back together after a bloody civil war. Such is the power of grit. Nelson Mandela had it. Gandhi and Martin Luther King had it as well. The question today is, do you have it? Do you have it? Because if you do, the odds of you getting the toys over the mountain are much higher than if you don't. It is one of those essential intangibles of leadership. Now, if you're curious how gritty you really are at this stage in your life, we have posted a grit assessment test. No kidding. A grit assessment test on our website. It'll only take you 5 minutes to do. It's free of charge. You'll get a grit score at the end of this little test, and you can compare your score with your teammates, and that's going to be very interesting. I predict some grit fights out in the parking lot afterwards. The bigger question, however, is, can grit be developed? The answer to this question contains both good and bad news. The good news is, yes, absolutely, grit can be developed in anybody who wants it. The bad news is that the arch enemy of grit is ease. So if your parents turned over heaven and earth to make your life easy, challenge-free, stress-free, they did you no favors regarding grit. Grit development demands difficulty. I'll say it again. Grit development demands difficulty. It demands a series of variously sized mountains for you to pull the train cars over so that when you get to the top after massive outputs of effort, you say on the backside of the mountain, I thought I could. I thought I could. I thought I could, which sets you up better from a confidence perspective for your next mountain. Grit grows every time you prove to yourself that you can overcome an obstacle with tenacity and perseverance. When my son Todd was about 9 or 10 years old, he wanted a dog more than life itself. I didn't want a dog, but I gradually relented and we got him one. One day, we decided that the dog needed to be outside more. So I bought a 24-inch metal stake that had to be driven into the hard-packed soil in our backyard so the dog could be out on a leash. I got a hammer. I gave the metal stake to Todd, and I said, it's your dog. This is your job to do. After 3 or 4 half-hearted hammer strikes, he tried to hand the hammer back to me, and he said, Dad, it's too hard. You do it. Right then and there, I decided to drive a different stake into the soil of his life. A grit stake. I handed him the hammer back, and I said, I have all afternoon to watch you pound this stake into the ground. I know the soil is hard. I know it's going to be a tough task. It's your dog. It's your job to do. And I don't care how long it takes or how hard it gets. It's yours to do. Well, it took well over an hour. It involved a tantrum or two and lots of tears. But this task was a grit developer. I made him stay with it until the job was done. I assigned both of my kids lots of difficult tasks during their growing up years. Both of them would score very high on the grit test that I just referred you to. And someday I truly believe they are going to rise up and call me blessed for having done all this. But that day has not arrived yet, and I don't see it on the horizon. One can hope. But let me say it again, the arch enemy of grit is ease. To grow grit, again, this very important intangible of leadership, you must assign yourself very difficult tasks and will yourself to task achievement. This is one reason why most elite leaders push themselves physically in some way. Just in our faculty here this year, Jim Collins, very serious rock climber. Craig Rochelle, a weightlifter, and so many examples of this around the world. Did you know that Larry Page, the co-founder of Google, is an aggressive kiteboarder, very physically demanding sport? Richard Branson, the CEO of Virgin Airlines, is a fearless windsurfer. I know that for a fact because I almost hit him with a powerboat last Christmas in the Virgin Islands. Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice works out every morning, 5 a.m. Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, works out every day, doesn't miss. Why? Because these elite leaders have figured out that overcoming physical challenges is one way to grow grit. And when you grow grit in any area of your life, it flows over to other areas as well. Here's another way to grow grit. Most elite leaders I know wound up in their current roles because earlier in their careers, they volunteered for extra work assignments, and then they demonstrated steely determination in carrying them out. Jack Welch is fond of saying to young professionals, when your supervisor gives you an assignment, whatever you do, don't just deliver the required result. He stops for a dramatic pause, and then he says, don't just deliver, over-deliver, and over-deliver every time. In our context, that would be saying, show grit. Another way to develop grit is to read biographies of people who had it, or hang around with people who have it now, because some of it actually can rub off. One final observation about the power of grit. When senior leaders demonstrate grittiness in their day-to-day leadership, what I mean is, when senior leaders push themselves hard, when they over-deliver in their own contribution to the collective effort, when they hang tough through a crisis, teammates and followers notice, and they develop an appetite for more grit in themselves. They start to push themselves to the next level, and eventually the whole organization gets grittier. And gritty organizations are unstoppable. So the point here is, if you care at all about getting the toys over the mountain, if you care at all about achieving whatever mission your life or organization is about, you simply must develop and demonstrate grit. It's an absolutely essential intangible of leadership. Let's move on to the second intangible of leadership, and this is self-awareness. Now, doesn't that sound dull? I mean, admittedly, self-awareness. Compared to vision casting, team building, problem solving, come on, you're yawning right now. I can feel it. But there's a lot more to this. And we're going to talk about two individuals, and this is sort of the line of consciousness, okay? I'll come back to this. First leader I want to tell you about, this guy over here, was raised by a raging, abusive father whose favorite pastime was telling his young son that he was worthless, stupid, and would never amount to anything. This kid survived that horrible upbringing, and when he was off at college, he had a transforming relationship or encounter with Jesus Christ, and he eventually decided to become a pastor. After all of his training, he was given his first church to lead. Within the first few years of leading that church, he led the little church into a controversial, multi-million-dollar building campaign for a new auditorium that was way bigger than the congregation needed. Within a few years of that debacle, as the church was drowning in debt, the board of that little church fired him. Well, that's kind of a sad story. Believe it or not, this same young pastor went on to do the same thing in the next two churches that he led. He built huge buildings, saddled the congregations with millions of dollars of debt. Just as he was being fired from church number 3, one of the board members asked in total frustration, "Why do you do this? I checked with the other two churches you pastored. You did the very same thing there. What's going on?" The better question would have been, who are you trying to impress? Who are you trying to impress? The answer to that question is obvious to all of us. Who was he trying to impress? Say it. His dad. He was totally unaware that the decisions he was making up here every day were tethered tightly to something unresolved that happened way back here with his dad. And so without self-awareness of that tethering and that behavior driven by that upbringing, how many more churches is he going to blow up before he grows in self-awareness? The other leader I want to briefly mention is the CEO of a faith-based charity that's experiencing stunning levels of growth under her capable leadership, so much so that about half the board of directors thinks it's time to take the ministry international, maybe 6 or 8 countries, and who knows beyond there. The problem is the other half of the board feels this move is premature. So board meetings have become very energized, and the decision is being discussed in very animated ways. When I learned of this exciting charity and this capable CEO, I wondered what the board would eventually decide. Then right in the middle of this exciting decision-making process, this fantastic female CEO offers her resignation. And to conserve time, let me give you the short story about her. Way back here, when she was a little girl, both of her parents became heavy drinkers. After lots of drinking, the fighting would start, and then the physical violence, which understandably terrified her. So her mission in life became to keep her parents from fighting. This worked once in a while, but when it didn't work, she would run to her room, crawl under her bed, and vibrate with fear until the police came. You know where this is headed? All these years later, the animated disagreement on her board triggers all of those memories that she had back here. Still tethered. She doesn't know it. Still tethered. And when she gets fearful of those kinds of animated conversations, then she decides, I can't take it anymore. So she resigns, which is just like running to her room and crawling under her bed. She is not aware that this is what's driving her quitting. When you read about a huge mess or meltdown in an organization, odds are that some part of that mess is being caused by low self-awareness on someone's part. And let me just say it, I'm not trying to start a fight with anybody. shocking percentages of leaders represented in this two-day event, shocking percentages of us every day make questionable decisions up here, totally unaware that they are being driven by something that's tethered back here. And unless that changes someday, it could potentially destroy your leadership, derail your entire career. Now, because we're having so much fun talking about this, I want to increase the pain, and I want to talk about blind spots in the lives of leaders. This, too, stems from low self-awareness. Blind spots are fascinating because they pertain to something a leader believes she or he is great at, when actually everyone else on the team knows that that's patently untrue. It's the CEO who believes that his monthly pep talks to the staff are really firing up the troops, when in actuality everybody knows they're a joke. He's making a laughing stock out of himself. Everyone knows it but him, you see. It's the leader who thinks she's great at finding and hiring fantastic people. Everyone on her team knows she's a terrible talent sniffer, possibly the world's worst, but she thinks she's the best. The definition of a blind spot is something someone believes they do well, but everyone on the team knows that it's not true. Research from the Lominger Group suggests that all of us leaders, on average, all of us leaders have 3.4 blind spots. And I can prove it right now. Because when I just gave you that stat, 3.4 blind spots in your life, 100% of you just said to yourself, not me. 100%. No, not me, I don't have any. It's because you're blind to your blind spots, you see? Now, we would all admit to having some weaknesses, and you could name them, and you're working on them, that's cool. But the danger with blind spots is that you really have no idea they exist. So, for decades, I have prided myself for being cool under pressure. I was a fantastic poker player in college. I'm low drama. I rarely raise my voice, slam doors, or pound on any tables. I'm great under pressure, so much so, very few people ever even know when I'm stressed, or so I thought. Several years ago, a perfect storm of pressure came into my life, which lasted several months. But I was going to stay calm, cool, and collected. I wasn't going to let anyone know I was under stress or make anybody else pay, because I'm awesome under pressure. Did I mention that? I'm awesome under pressure. One day during that era, as a female colleague of mine was leaving my office, she got to my office door, she turned around and she said, "You don't even know that you make all of us crazy when you're stressed out. You don't even know that, do you?" She said, "Just because you're on a crazy train right now gives you no right to expect that we all have to ride it too. So just so that you know, I'm not getting on the crazy train with you this time. I'm going to stay at the station and wave bye-bye to you and whoever else wants to get on that train." She goes, "I'm done with that." So she closes the door and leaves. I was speechless, okay? So I sat there thinking to myself, I'm better under pressure than any senior leader I know. She ought to thank God on her knees every day that she works for a boss who can carry tremendous loads of pressure without anybody even knowing about it, much less having to pay for it. The nerve. After work that day, I went running with a trusted friend, and I told him how a colleague of mine had accused me of something totally untrue of me. I told him how wronged I felt, how misunderstood and hurt I was to be falsely accused of not being cool under pressure. My running partner stopped dead in the middle of the street we were running on, and he said, "Are you kidding me, Hybels? Everybody knows when you're stressed. When you're stressed, you put stress on all of us." And then his next sentence was kind of the capper. He said, "When you overwork, you're not happy unless everyone around you is overworking too. And we all know it and we all feel it, but you don't get it." That was quite a moment of truth for me. Later on that night, as I was licking my wounds, I thought about what had happened on campus earlier that day. I was walking real fast from one meeting to the next, and I walked past a Willow staff member who was washing windows. I was way too busy, to greet that guy. So I never broke stride as I walked past him, but I was thinking about that. I remembered from earlier that day, what bothered me as I walked past that guy who was working on the window, said he was whistling. He was whistling on church property, on church time, on the payroll, okay? And I remember thinking to myself, if he has the extra lung capacity to whistle, what he ought to do is convert that energy to washing that window harder and faster. He ought to be groaning with agony as he's washing that window. He ought to be, here it comes, moment of self-awareness. He ought to be as miserable as I am right now. He ought to be as stressed and miserable as I am right now. And that was the moment when I reflected on what my female colleague said, my running partner, and thinking of that experience. That was the moment I saw my blind spot in all of its ugliness. It was very disappointing to me. How could I have not seen this in myself? So I started confessing this to my friends, and they tried to be very understanding. They're going, the light bulb just went on now, dude. That's what blind spots are, you see. Now, after I did talk about this, I could move that blind spot into my weakness category. And it's in my weakness category now, and I still have a lot of work to do on it, but at least it's identified. Here's the question: do you have any blind spots? Now, the research says you've got 3.4 on average, but maybe you're the exception, right? Hey, if you were worried about your blind spots, how would you go about identifying them? Guess who has the greatest insights into your blind spots in the work environment? Data shows that your direct supervisor probably has the best insight about your blind spots, followed by your peers, friends, and colleagues. But if you're tough enough, and if you want the total, brutal, unvarnished truth about your blind spots, line up all your current and past spouses and all the mother-in-laws you've ever had, ask them about your blind spots, and you'll get the truth. You'll get the truth right between the eyes. I just hope you can handle the truth. But let me say one last time, self-awareness is a very big deal. It's one of these intangibles of leadership. Knowing how your past is messing with the decisions you're making today is crucial information. Identifying your blind spots before they fatally damage your relationship to others or the organization is a really big deal, which begs the question, how do you grow in self-awareness? This much is for sure: it will not happen in isolation. Growth in self-awareness demands input from others, honest feedback. It requires having vulnerable conversations with supervisors, colleagues, friends, and oftentimes with professional coaches and professional counselors. These conversations must deal with questions like, hey, you tell me the brutal, total truth. What do I really do well? And please tell me, what don't I do well? Be candid, please. Do you think I have some blind spots? What would they be? Tell me, give me the last 2% of truth. Don't edit. Now, what you hear from these folks might be very, very hard for you the first time that you hear it. But over time, you will come to see them as good gifts from people who really care about you and who are rooting for you to be the best leader you can be. All to say, everybody will win when you grow in self-awareness. Everybody. And the likelihood of the toys getting over the mountain will greatly increase. So please do whatever you can do to grow in this intangible of leadership. The third intangible I want to surface is something I touched on last year, but I want to underscore it briefly again this year. Resourcefulness. Resourcefulness. Some people refer to this as learning agility. Resourceful people are quick learners. They are endlessly curious about how things work. They're collaborators, tweakers, inventors, enthusiastic experimenters. The Korn Ferry Group found that organizations that grow this skill, the skill of resourcefulness, amongst their executive teams, outpace their competitors by 25%. Individuals with high learning agility are promoted twice as fast as those who are low in it. Last year, I made the point that in a world that changes as rapidly as our world changes, senior leaders are often thrust into situations where they honestly don't know what to do. But instead of panicking or putting their heads in the sand, people with high learning agility roll up their sleeves and they start figuring out what it is that they should do. This summer, I read David McCullough's book about the Wright brothers, who built and flew the first engine-powered airplane, something no one had been able to figure out how to do since Garden of Eden days. Now, neither of these brothers were college-trained, nor were they wealthy. But what fascinated in me as I read the book was the learning process that led to the building and the flying of the first airplane. To start out, the Wright brothers studied birds, get this, for years. They studied birds for years. They examined the shape of their wings and their surface-to-weight ratios. Eventually, they built their airplane wings to those specs. When they realized that a cast-iron engine would be too heavy to propel their plane through the air, they figured out, believe it or not, they figured out how to build an engine out of aluminum. First time it had ever been done. No small feat. When they realized that the winds in Ohio were not strong or steady enough to provide lift for their little airplane, they packed up and moved their whole operation to a sand dune on the east coast of the United States where the winds blew steady and strong. Every time they came up against an insurmountable challenge, instead of giving up, packing up, going home, they did the opposite. They experimented and failed. Then they experimented and failed again. And yet they stayed at it until they figured it out. Remember that expression from last year? They figured it out. That's just what resourceful people do. It's what differentiates them from everybody else. Resourceful people figure it out. Finally, on December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers' airplane took off in flight, and people have been losing their bags on airliners ever since. I sure wish they could figure that out, don't you? So much of the success of the Wright brothers was directly attributed to their near addiction to learning. So much of your success in coming years is going to be dependent on your ability to grow in resourcefulness, which begs the question, can resourcefulness be developed? Here again, I have good news and bad news. The good news is, yes, absolutely, resourcefulness can be developed. The bad news is, the primary way it gets developed is by putting yourself in situations that are confused, broken, or dysfunctional, and forcing yourself to experiment and fail, collaborate, whatever, to figure out a way forward and staying at it until you do. My son Todd is nearing the completion of his helicopter pilot training. When I asked him recently what his latest flying lesson was focused on, he said, basically trying to stay alive, Dad. And I said, what's that about? And he said, well, the instructor that day had put him in all sorts of awkward and dangerous attitudes in the helicopter, took his hands off the control and said, save us. And at one point he shut the engine down, he turned to Todd and said, figure out how to land this thing without killing us. Now, I suppose that's one way to microwave resourcefulness. But last year, I asked you to identify real problems in your organization and then to assemble short-term task forces of emerging young leaders to try to solve these real problems. In so doing, you will see who on these teams has high levels of learning agility or resourcefulness, which then allows you to put them on a developmental track for senior leadership positions someday. I followed my own advice on this, and in this past year, several times since our last year's summit, I put several young staff into situations on short-term task forces and watched people who had learning agility that I never knew did. These particular staff members, once they've been identified as being resourceful, they are leapfrogging over their peers because our organization is desperate for resourceful leaders. Yours is too, by the way. So now that's all I want to say about resourcefulness for now, knowing full well that some of you want to know where you can get more information on this subject matter, what books, what website you could access to learn and figure out more about this. And my 3 words for you would be, figure it out. Number 4, to help you understand the fourth, seldom discussed, but extremely critical intangible of leadership, I want to explain one brief but unforgettable episode in the life of a leader named David from the Older Testament of the Bible. This young leader is David of David and Goliath fame. And speaking of fame, his popularity skyrocketed after him taking care of business with Goliath. So the current king gets all jealous and wants to kill David. So David has no other choice. He has to kind of organize a personal militia to protect himself. So he puts the word out about who would want to join his militia. And listen to the Bible's explanation of the caliber of people who enlisted in David's private army. The text says, all his followers were in distress or in debt or discontented, and there were about 400 of them. This was not a dream team. All of the highly elite soldiers had already been drafted into other militias, so essentially, David winds up with leftovers, troublemaking rejects. And if any of you just thought to yourself, that sounds a lot like the people in my organization, I feel your pain. But this is the current reality of the culture that David has to start with. These are the only available personnel. Now, if you were to read the next several chapters of the Bible, you would see David put on an absolute leadership clinic. He trains and he coaches the troops. He empowers and inspires them. He finds out what they do well, and he assigns them tasks that align with their top skills. He identifies potential leaders and people managers, and he organizes the troop under them. He does all of this with a kind of sensitivity that the soldiers begin to realize, hey, I'm not just a piece of equipment in this militia. And over time, they realize that David actually carries a deep personal concern in his heart for each of them. Go figure. Well, now this melts their heart toward David, and before you know it, this entire army feels a deep loyalty and devotion to him, and increasingly, they feel a kind of loyalty and fondness for each other. So one night, something extraordinary happens that's going to be talked about in this militia group for years to come. An enemy army sneaks up on David's small militia, surprises them, surrounds them, cuts off their supply lines. So with no food or water, it's only a matter of time that David's either going to have to fight his way out of this situation or raise the white flag of surrender. One night, David calls a meeting with his 3 senior-most leaders. He explains the gravity of the situation. They're sobered. Just before they all decide to crash for the night, David yawns and he says, last thought of the day, oh, that I could drink water from the well by Bethlehem, by the Bethlehem gate. He says that, and then he passes out, goes to sleep. The Bible says that these 3 senior leaders who have been so impacted by David's personal concern for them and his investment in them, that they suit up for action without David knowing about it. They sneak through the enemy camp, and they find the well that David was thinking about. They draw some water, they sneak back through enemy lines, they wake up David and they say, hey, David, we got the water from the well you love so much. Question, what would most leaders do if their subordinates did something like that for them? Gulp down the water, hopefully thank them, drift back to sleep, maybe make a note to mention this brave act in their mid-year review? What would other leaders do when presented a jug of water that 3 people had risked their lives to procure? Maybe other leaders would share the water. Get 4 cups, divide it all up equally, tip their glasses to each other, satiate their thirst together all at once. Do you remember what David does? Quote, David refused to drink the water. Let me read it again. David refused to drink the water. Instead, he poured it out on the ground as a drink offering to God. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. What an idiot. The guy is disrespecting his key 3 leaders, and all the water's wasted. What's he thinking? That's terrible leadership. I hold a different view. I think what David did with the water was one of the most astonishing demonstrations of effective leadership recorded in all of history. In fact, I think if leaders in this gathering and leaders all around the world would follow David's example in this brief text, it would transform organizations in every corner of our planet. Such is the power of self-sacrificing love. The 4th intangible of leadership, self-sacrificing love. What really happened that night when David awakened with this jug of his favorite water being pushed into his face by these guys who had just risked their lives to get it, is that David had a flashback all the way back to the day he formed this little militia of 400 despairing, bankrupt malcontents. He remembers the early days when no one knew each other, no one trusted each other. The only reason they signed up was to get the small wage that David would provide at the end of each day. David remembered in the early days the bickering and the quarreling, the positioning and the politics of this ragtag group. But this particular night, when he's holding the water that three guys had risked their lives to provide for him, all of a sudden he realizes that all of his investments in these guys, all of it has paid off. Every single one of them. He remembers how God had whispered to him in the early days of his leadership over that group of 400. He remembered the times God had whispered to him, David, I want you to love these guys. I know they're not the cream of the crop. I know they're a ragtag group. I want you to love these guys. I want you to love them as I love you. I want you to love them from your heart. I want you to love them like family. Here's a good one. I want you to make it personal in your leadership with these guys. Don't keep the professional veil up. I want this to be personal with these guys. Serve them, invest in them, inspire them, empower them, pray for them by name. What God was teaching David in his early days of leadership over that ragtag group is that self-sacrificing love is at the very core of leadership. God was reminding David that vision is not the core of leadership. It is critical, it's not the core of the core. Nor is strategy or problem solving. They're all critical as well, but they are not the core of the core, nor will they ever be. Gang, listen, self-sacrificing love has always been and will always be at the absolute core of leadership. Remember 1 Corinthians 13:8, simple phrase, love never fails. Love never leaves a heart the way it found it, ever. Love changes people. Love changes teammates and subordinates and supervisors. Love changes board members, dock workers, salespeople, and janitors. Love melts people and molds people into tightly knit communities that feel more like families than work groups. And David realizes that God's whispers to him in those early days to love this motley crew from his heart, it eventually resulted in a supernatural transformation over time. So he turns to these three guys and he says, in effect, I appreciate what you did. God deserves this incredible provision way more than I do, because you see, God assembled our ragtag group in the first place. God prompted me every single day how to lead you, how to build into you, how to love you. And look what he's done. He's turned us into a family. I imagine David said some words of gratitude to these three buddies, maybe a prayer of thanksgiving to God, and then he slowly pours the water out on the ground as a drink offering to the God who loved him and who he loved. How do you think that experience affected David's top three guys? How many times would that story be told around campfires to all the rest of the troops? What do you think it did for the troops' devotion and affection for David in the future? Gang, we live in a day of celebrity leaders with narcissistic blood flowing through their veins. We live in a day where instead of leaders demonstrating self-sacrificing love for their teammates, they often pit their subordinates against each other in a vicious battle for who can stroke the ego of the senior leader the best. We live in a day where trust in organizations is dangerously low, cynicism is unacceptably high, and at the root of all of this is a lack of old-fashioned, self-sacrificing, altruistic love, which must begin in the heart of the senior leaders of every organization. It just must. Everyone in every organization takes their cues from the senior leader. Can you hear this, senior leaders? You all know by now that the Gallup organization measures what it is that separates toxic organizations from thriving organizations, and it's highly correlated to one key survey question, which asks, do workers feel personal concern coming from their managers? Personal concern. In an organization where workers feel, can I say it, genuine love coming from their supervisors, deep personal concern, the entire organization behaves and performs differently and so much better. Can I quote the verse again? Love never fails. Said differently, love changes the order of things. Now, I stand before you today as a living example of this. Had a certain leader not reached out to me with self-sacrificing love 4 decades ago, I would probably be a half-hearted Christ follower leading a toxic organization whose unstated mission would be to make me richer. But back in my college years, a theology professor kept pestering us students to cancel our life plans and to build new kinds of churches in our increasingly troubled world. One day after class, I did something I had never done. I'm not the type, trust me. Something I'd never done in 4 years of undergrad work. I left the lecture, I walked down a long hallway where the faculty offices were located, and I knocked on that professor's door. He had just taught a long class, he had another one to teach later. But his lecture about the beauty and the power and the potential of the local church had set my heart on fire. So I took the risk, and I walked down that long hallway, and I knocked on this guy's door. And when he opened the door, I could tell he didn't know who I was or why I was there. He had hundreds of students. I was no one special. I nervously told him I didn't want to bother him. I knew he had to teach again shortly, but I was just wondering if he had 10 minutes to spare to talk to me more about how to build one of these cool new churches he had just described in his lecture. Gang, when I look back now on what was hanging in the balance as I stood at the threshold of his door, I tremble. Because if he had waved me off with professional reserve, if he'd handed me over to a neophyte intern who didn't give a rip, I'm pretty sure that would have been enough to extinguish the barely flickering flame that God had just ignited in me to start a church. But the exact opposite thing happened. Dr. B, this professor, said warmly, come in, sit down. Can I get you anything? How can I help you? I told him his lectures were making my head explode. And he said, well, would you come to my house, be a guest? I'll fix lunch next week, and we'll spend an afternoon trying to understand why God is stirring in your heart the way he is. Please come, he said, please come to my house. I stared back at him with utter disbelief. A PhD from Boston University, an author, a towering theologian, offering to cook me lunch and spend an afternoon in his backyard helping me discern my future. What is that verse again? Love never fails. It changes people. And it changed me that day. Fast forward the story. Dr. B did, in fact, cook me lunch at his home. He spent the entire afternoon with me, and in an unforgettable act of self-sacrificing love, said at the end of our time together, Bill, I'm happy to make myself available to you anytime to help this new church that God is stirring in your heart. And gang, the truth is, that's the day Willow Creek Church was born, in his backyard, with that act and expression of self-sacrificing love. And for 40 years, Dr. B has... For 40 years, Dr. B has invested in me, served me, guided me, admonished me, counseled me, mentored me, and loved me sacrificially. He's been one of God's greatest gifts to me, and he's with us today. And I wonder if we can get a quick shot of him, and if you would just honor him. You got to be a little careful. He's 112 years old now, Got a bunch of plastic parts in them, so don't rile them up. I really wish that every single leader had someone like him in your life, because love never fails. Last week I read 1 Corinthians 13 with my leadership lenses on, and here's how it read. If I cast vision with the tongues of men and angels and have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of strategic planning and financial forecasting and have not love, I'm bound to make the future of my organization cold-hearted and cynical. If I solve problems, engineer change, and allocate resources at a world-class level, but fail to love my colleagues, I denigrate my workplace and devalue those who deserve better from me. Love is patient and kind. Love is not envious of others' success. Love does not keep track of others' mistakes. Rather, love engenders openness and trust, vulnerability and candor, hope and optimism. There remain three: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. It always will be, gang. So here's my final challenge on this point. Don't hesitate a single additional moment in showing and expressing genuine concern and love to your teammates. Tear down these professional veils that keep your heart cold and closed off from your coworkers. Get personal. Say the affirming or the encouraging words, or write them, or send the message by smoke signal if necessary. Doing so will humanize and ennoble workplaces and create a powerful, caring, high-performance culture you just watch. And need I remind you one more time that this all starts with the senior-most leaders in every organization. The quality of your loving senior leaders will set the tone for the entire organization. Please, please, please get this right. Finally, let me make brief mention of one final intangible of leadership, which is the absolutely essential need to create a sense of meaning in the life of each and every follower or fellow worker under your influence. Simon Sinek's book, Start with the Why, can be summarized in 3 circles. Maybe you've seen him do this with a TED Talk. And he simply says, pretty much, there's the what in an organization, there's the how, bad H, and then there's the why, okay? Now, he argues the point that almost all leaders and teammates understand the what that an organization does. We make computers, we sell furniture, we provide hotel rooms, we put on church services, we feed the hungry. Almost everybody in an organization understands the what. And basically, almost everyone understands the how. Amazon sells products. How? On the internet. Starbucks sells coffee. How? In hip-looking coffee shops on pretty much every block on the planet. Most people understand the what and the how of what their organizations are about. Sinek makes the point and says the huge disconnect is the why. Why should we make computers? Why do we sell furniture? Why do we provide hotel rooms? Why do we put on church services or feed the hungry? In their recent book, The Real Life MBA, Jack and Susie Welch suggest changing every leader's title to Chief Meaning Officers. Chief Meaning Officers. I love that. They too know that even more than the what and the how, leaders in tomorrow's world will have to build a compelling case for the why of everyone's job. Why should they come to work early, busted all day, and joyfully stay late every now and then? Why should someone stay loyal to your organization when the internet shows opportunities in similar organizations just down the street for even more money? As I wrap things up, I want to have a heart-to-heart with every single leader at the summit this year. And I want to talk to you about your white-hot why. I want to poke around in what is at the absolute core of why you do what you do. Bob Buford, who wrote a book about moving from success to significance, tells about the time in his life when he hired a high-powered strategic planner, not to help him double his cable TV empire, but to help him plan what he was supposed to do with the second half of his personal life. After a few hours of dialogue, this strategic planner drew a box at the top of a piece of paper and said, Bob, I've heard two subjects that seem to be very important to you, money and God. For me to do my strategic planning for the second half of your life, you have to decide what goes in that top box. Because if it's money, that's fine. I can help you earn mountains more of it. If it's God, we got to figure out a plan to honor that choice, but this is a decision you have to make. What the planner was probing at was Bob's white-hot why. And what I'm probing at now is what is in your top box, really. Now, there's not an ounce of judgment in me right now. I'm just seeking for clarity for each of you. Because your why, what's in your top box, will either fuel you to higher and higher levels of inspiration and effectiveness as a leader, or it will begin to reveal that what you've had in your top box is no longer stirring deep passion in you, and it's time to put something new in your top box. Steve Jobs, who built Apple Computer Company, was trying to recruit a senior executive from a soft drink company to come and help him build Apple. At one point, he said to the guy, do you really want to keep selling sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to join me and help change the world? Can you sense the power of having a white-hot why? Changing the world. Boy, you could invite someone into that, couldn't you? Howard Schultz, who built Starbucks, keeps telling the employees, we don't simply sell coffee. We provide a third place in people's lives, a critically important space between their work and home for people to gather their thoughts or for people to gather with friends. He says, but this much is for sure. Our why is so much deeper than selling coffee, and it's worth giving your best efforts to. Rich Stearns, the current president of World Vision, was formerly the CEO of Lenox Fine China. His company made the most beautiful dinner plates in the world and sold them mostly to very rich people. Making more millions from that job began to lose its motivational power in Rich's life. He needed something new in his top box, and he had some unconscious awareness that he needed a new white-hot why. Many years ago, God prompted him and said, what if you shifted your why from making luxury plates for rich people to putting food on empty plastic plates of poor people? Rich Stearns' white-hot why changed that day. And since then, he has been passionately leading an organization that feeds millions of starving children in the name of Christ, and he loves it more today than when he started so many years ago. How cool is that? That's the power of having the right thing in your top box and understanding your white-hot why. Can I ask you again? What is in your top box? What is it that moves you and drives you as a leader to get better and better every year? Do you know? Do you know with blinding clarity what's there? While you're thinking about that, can I spend just a couple moments telling you about my white-hot why? Warning, fair warning. It's a little bit religious in nature, but we all respect each other, don't we? Okay, so I was sitting on an airplane next to a guy one time, and the guy finds out I'm a pastor. That's everyone's worst nightmare. So he said, hey, after he found out I was a pastor, he said, hey, we don't need to talk about religion because I'm good with God. I said, hey, I'm glad you're good with God. I'm not a very good preacher, and so the fact that we don't have to cover this is good with me. And he goes, good, because I'm pretty sure I'm good with God. I go, well then, okay, fine. And a few minutes later, he goes, you know, I go to church twice a year. I give some money at the end of the year. Decent dad, I work hard, I vote Republican. I think I'm good, aren't I? I said, listen, if you're going to keep talking about it, do you have any interest in what the Bible actually says makes you good with God? He goes, well, I got some time to kill. Go ahead. So I took out a piece of paper, just wrote God at the top, reminded that God is perfect, absolutely holy. Okay? And then I drew a vertical line like this. So I said to the guy, hey, you're telling me that you're good and you're good with God. Do you mean that if this is a vertical line of how moral and wonderful and spiritual and, you know, how upstanding you are you about this good? Like just bumping your head up against the perfection of God? And he goes, well, you know. And I said, well, let's talk about good people. And Mother Teresa was alive at that point. And I said, who's the best person you know? He said, probably Mother Teresa. And I said, I've read everything she's ever written. And she says in her writings that she has deep regrets and she's disappointed God. She mouthed off to a couple of her superiors. She got in some fights with some of her sisters. And I said, I don't know for sure, but I think if Mother Teresa were going to put an X on where she is on this goodness ladder, I said, I think Mother Teresa would like put herself down here somewhere. I said, who else is good? And he said, well, maybe Billy Graham. I said, I actually met him a couple times. He does not carry a picture of me around in his wallet. But I said, he asked me one time to pray for him because he felt that he had disappointed God in some way. And I said, he's a very humble guy. I don't know for sure. I think he'd put himself on this vertical space a little lower than Mother Teresa, perhaps. Now, quick time out, real time now. Any of you read what Pope Francis did the moment he found out, the new Pope? Do you read what he said the minute he found out he was going to be the next Pope? Direct quote, I am a very sinful man that God has looked kindly upon. The Pope, okay? So maybe, Pope Francis is, somewhere. So then I tell this guy, I go, I've been a pastor for several decades, and I would put myself, south of Billy Graham. So if this is that whole goodness thing, I gave him a pen, and I said, put yourself anywhere you want on here. So he puts himself just a little beneath me right there. So then he goes, am I in trouble? I said, well, here's the deal. If God's perfect, you see, you have a gap. You have a gap. And I said, here's the deal. And this is an amazing thing. God sees your gap and loves you anyway. And what God did was God provided his son, Jesus Christ. I said, no, this will only take a second. But what God did is he took all of your garbage and mine and all this, and he transferred all of our wrongdoings onto the shoulders of Jesus Christ, who died an atoning death for the sins of the world. And then he infuses his righteousness into our lives. And if you can believe this, he puts us in right standing with God. He puts us in right standing with God. And so I said to him, now the coolest thing about all this is that it's available to everybody. You don't have to try to clean up your act. This is something you receive. And I showed him a verse in the Bible. It is by grace you have been redeemed through faith. It is not something you can earn, or say in another way, this is something you cannot earn. It's a gift from God, not of works, so no one can boast. Gang, the information on that little napkin that I drew for that guy that day blew his mind. It just seemed too good to be true. But here's what I'm driving at, back to my main point. This message of what Christ does for wrongdoing people like me, that message, when I first understood it as a 17-year-old, simply transformed my life. And when I started to tell my friends about it, it started transforming their lives. And eventually, as I told more and more people and saw more and more lives change, one day I came to the conclusion, my white-hot why is never going to be money. My white-hot why is never going to be mere pleasure. My white-hot why is not going to be about fame or power. My white-hot why is transformed lives. It's watching God release people from guilt and shame. It's watching God transform hateful people into loving people, greedy people into generous people, prejudiced people into radically inclusive people, self-centered people into other-centered people who care for the poor and the marginalized. Transformed lives, that's what's in my top box. That's my white-hot why. And when I came to that conclusion, I thought, I need to start a church and get this message out to every single person I can. And for what it's worth, my passion 40 years into this is stronger now than it's ever been before. And I can say in front of our church anytime, I can say, hey, what's your white-hot why? Because if it's transformed lives, join our church. Dive in and give your best efforts, because that's what our church is about. I can also say to people, if that isn't what's in your top box, then please find out what is in your top box. Pursue it with all your heart, because life is too short to live with no white-hot why or a fuzzy why, or to try to live with someone else's why. Gang, you must find yours. And you must live it out with all of your heart, because if you do, your grit factor will go through the roof. You'll demonstrate passion and perseverance over a long period of time because you believe so deeply in your mission. You'll be motivated to become more self-aware and to root out your blind spots because your white-hot why is too important to imperil it with self-sabotaging behaviors. Your resourcefulness will ascend to all new levels because you have to figure out how to get the toys over the mountain. Your crystal clear, white-hot why will ennoble your heart to want to express self-sacrificing love to colleagues and staff and constituents, not just to follow the example of Christ, but because it's going to take unity, trust, and total teamwork to achieve your mission. Closing thought. 2 weeks ago, I was reminded how high the stakes of leadership really are. My wife's mom had a massive stroke at her home in Michigan. Her husband called 911. The emergency responders arrived immediately and functioned like a well-oiled machine, my father-in-law told us later. They were organized, efficient, and extremely well-led. Not a minute was wasted treating her at the scene. Lynn's mom was put in an ambulance, raced to an efficient, well-managed, well-run emergency room. Anyone ever been in a poorly managed emergency room? It's crazy making. This was not like that. The team of medics who worked on her was led by a woman doctor who made sure every possible means to save Lynn's mom would be enacted. And when all that failed, and Lynn's mom died, that woman doctor and her team delivered that tough news to us like an angel from heaven. When we needed to arrange the funeral service, a leadership-oriented local pastor said, I would love for our church to host this funeral. I'll make sure our staff takes care of this whole thing and makes it effortless for your family. Even the CEO of the funeral home impressed us with his leadership, sensitivity, and professionalism. So in recent days, I have been reminded afresh just how much leadership matters. And it matters so much. It matters in every industry. It matters across all disciplines. It matters in government and business, in churches and non-for-profits. It matters in life, and it most certainly matters in death. So leaders, I'm asking you again this year, step it up. I'm asking you to find your white-hot why and turn over heaven and earth to fulfill it. I'm unapologetically asking you to get gritty, to identify your blind spots and get rid of them. I'm asking you to get more resourceful, and for God's sake, I'm asking you to demonstrate self-sacrificing love to your colleagues. Because if you do, the toys will get over the mountain, missions will get accomplished, and the God we serve will receive the glory. Thank you.